Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carol Booth Olson. I'm a professor in the School of Education at UCI and the director of the Wright Center. The co-principal investigators of the center are Steve Graham from ASU, Mark Warschauer from UCI, and Tanya Baker from the National Writing Project. Co-investigators include Penelope Collins and Young Suk Kim from UCI, and some of our staff helping us are Tamara Tate, Janelle Krishnan, and Jacob Stice are all helping out with the project as well. The goal of the Wright Center is to become a sort of go-to place for people who are interested in improving the writing of secondary students, and we're hoping that it will draw both researchers and practitioners to be a place where we can all work together to improve the academic writing of our students. To officially launch our center today, we have a speech by Steve Graham. I'll be introducing Steve in a moment, and then we're going to follow that with a panel with some amazing experts who are helping us to envision what this center will be. So Steve is going to talk to us today about best practices that we know from research that improves secondary writing instruction. Steve is a Warner Professor from the Division of Leadership and Innovation at Arizona State University. I'm sure you're very familiar with his Carnegie Corporation white papers that have been downloaded really hundreds of thousands of times, like Writing Next, Writing to Read, Informing Writing. He's also the editor of the Journal of Ed Psych. He's the editor of the Handbook on Writing Research, the editor of Best Practices in Writing Instruction, and together with his better half, Karen Harris, who we always want to put first as the initiator of SRSD, Self-Regulated Strategy and Development. Steve has his own intervention that's really made a difference with really thousands of students all over the world. So I want to welcome Steve up to the podium. He's going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it to questions. So please give a warm welcome to Steve Graham.
I always like to start with a story. St. Peter is sitting at the pearly gates, and he hears a knock on the door. And he says, "Who is it?" And a voice comes back and says, "It is I." And St. Peter says, "Damn, it's another English teacher." And they get to talking, and the guy asks, "Where am I going to live?" St. Peter says, "Come on, I'll show you." And they start floating through heaven, and they come to this beautiful neighborhood, really nice houses, lawns, there's swimming pools and people out congregating. And the guy says, "Is this where I'm going to live?" St. Peter says, "No, this is where the lawyers live." And so the guy's a little disappointed, and they float on, and they come to another neighborhood, even better than the last one, but this one has running tracks and tennis courts, and the guy's certain this is it. And when he asks St. Peter says, "No, this is where the doctors live." Now, they come to a third, and now there are museums, movie theaters, and the guy, he's certain, and he's right. He says, "Is this where educators live?" And St. Peter says, "Yes, it is." The guy takes a look, and he realizes there's no people there. And he said, "Don't educators go to heaven?" And St. Peter says, "Yes, they do, but they're in hell today, listening to a lecture by a university expert." So let's hope this isn't going to be hell. Okay. So before getting started, I think one of the things that's really important to say, when we talk about writing, I like to try to keep three things in mind. And one of those things is that it is really complex. And for those of us who are teachers or English teachers or history teachers or social studies or science teachers who are interested in writing, it's good to keep this in mind. It's complex in multiple ways. One is complex because it takes place in communities, and every community differs in some ways from the next one. You know, purposes for writing differ. How writing is valued differs. What's the norms for writing? What's the identity of the community? What's the identity of writers? What are the kind of social routines and instructional routines that exist for writing? They're not the same, even in two English classes sitting next to each other. So kids have to learn this stuff. A lot of it they learn through experience and participation, but there's also things that we can do as teachers as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The other part, it's complex cognitively. So if you just, I won't try to cover the whole ball of wax here, but you have basic knowledge that you bring to the task of writing. That includes knowledge of the topic, knowledge of processes that you can use to help you achieve your goals. It includes knowledge of language. It includes reading knowledge. And it also includes beliefs. And a lot of these beliefs really make a determination on how engaged we are in the process. So what's your efficacy for writing? How do you value it, or what's your attitudes towards it? What do you think counts for success? Why do you write? Is it internally driven or externally driven? In addition to this, we have a number of production processes that we apply, and we may be more or less skilled at each of those, even in middle school and high school. And these two things are interacting together. So how well we write depends not only on the community in which we are operating, but it also includes what we bring to that task and their interactions between the two. I don't know exactly how we move forward, but that's not going to work. Can you bring it back? So another thing that on this slide that I wanted to talk about is writing is also not a single thing. Okay, so I'm pretty good at academic writing, but heaven help me if I had to write a poem for anybody. I'm not so good at that. Also, heaven help me if I had to write a novel. And so when we take a look at kids, whether they're in middle school, high school, any grade, they have strengths in terms of writing, and they have emerging areas of development. And this occurs throughout life. Also, writing is extremely challenging. And you all know this, so I don't really need to say much about it. We can make it simple by just dumping out of our head any thought that comes to mind. But good writing typically is very planful, very thoughtful, it's monitored, it's evaluated, it's revised. So that's the backdrop in terms of which we're working. We want to help kids become not just good writers, but the best writers they can be, and not just writers who write when we ask, but the most motivated writers that we can help them become. Now, in terms of what I'm going to share with you today, I've been spending about the last 15 or 20 years trying to get a handle on what might be best practices in writing, but this comes with a number of caveats. And I want to make clear what those are so that there's no misunderstanding on this. So when I talk about best practices here, I'm talking about what we've derived from 3 sources. These are not the only sources. It's just where we're at this point in time in terms of our analysis of the scholarly literature. Those include, kind of those traditional true and quasi experiments where one group's given a writing treatment and another group's giving something else or nothing at all. It also includes single participant designs, which are often used with kids with special needs, and there's quite a few of those. What I can say is both of those types of research say pretty much the same thing, which gives me a little bit more confidence. And the third, which I think is particularly important, says the same thing for the most part, but extends it, are qualitative studies of exceptional teachers. And Judith Langer, who's sitting here, has done some work in that area, as well as a number of other people. So what we've tried to do is put that together, and what I'm going to say to you today is I've tried to take that a step up by identifying some more general attributes of what would be a good writing instruction or best practices, and I'll give some examples that are supported by the literature. And in doing so, you'll see some different colors pop up every now and then. You'll see a red, but I won't say what that's for right now. But you'll also see a blue, and where that blue comes from is Carol and I and some other people in this room worked on the What Works Clearinghouse Secondary Writing Guide. And I hate to say this, we only had 3 recommendations, but these guys are really tight on what they'll accept as research, and so it's very limiting. But if you see a WWC, a blue by there, that means it was also, in a sense, sanctioned by them. And it may give it a little bit more credibility to you or may not. I've also tried to give you a sense of what the impact of the instructional procedure is. But I'm really cautious here because I got burned on this once, and Carol actually was the one who pointed it out to me. The first time I met her, in fact. So I'll tell you what the question was. I was sitting in a room giving a presentation, I think somewhere in the DC area, after What Works Clearinghouse had come, after Writing Next had come out, and she raised her hand, and I thought, do I know her? And I realized I did, and I said, yeah. And she said, do you know that some schools are taking the 3 recommendations with the highest effect sizes and only applying those? And I was stunned because it was never our intention, and we had mistakenly listed those highest to lowest effect sizes. What a dumb thing to do. You know, the unintended consequences of that were evident to me right away. These treatments are not compared one to the other. I can't say that one's better than the other. I can say when this is in play and it's been compared to some other things, this is kind of in the green. I'll tell you what the percentile jump is on an average for kids in general, starting from the 50th. And so if it's a 17th percent jump, you can figure that's jumping you to the 67th percentile. The other thing that's really important for me to say, and I don't think this gets said often enough about research-supported practices. Just because they worked in a research study does not mean they're going to work in your classroom. You know, often in research studies, there's a lot of other resources in play. There's a lot of preparation that goes on. Their context is different. Their children and youngsters are different than yours. So what I can say to you in this case, the way that we've approached it, I'm only sharing with you things that have been replicated in multiple studies. My bottom line is 4, not a lot. You know, I wish I was saying 225, but I'd like to have something to say to you. And so I want you to realize that they've worked in other situations, but it's a buyer beware presentation. And by that, what I mean is, try it out. Take it for a ride, but see if it works. And if it doesn't, you may need to modify it. And if it doesn't, you may need to think this might not be the right thing for you or your kids. The other part of this is that I think one of the things that kind of gets lost in the shuffle on evidence-based practice is that it's assumed that those of us doing what I'm doing today, talking with you, are suggesting that, you know, you kick out everything you do and you do these things. That's never been its purpose. The purpose is to share with you things that have worked with other people for you to use your professional judgment or clinical judgment, if you want to look at that way from where evidence-based practices came out of medicine, and to do this and use it in a smart way. It is not meant to degrade or deny the skills that you've learned through your practices as a teacher. So I want to say that before I take another step forward. Okay, I got 5 words to say, and I can leave after that. But you know, I'm a university professor, so obviously I'm not going to go away that quickly. So I started thinking about, you know, all this stuff that we've been looking at and how it might play out in classrooms. Because I could make a list of instructional practices and say, oh, it's got this effect, and it's up to you to kind of put it together in terms of how you think about it and what's important for writing. So in a sense, I've given you my take on this. And so as far as I'm concerned, this applies whether you're an English teacher, an elementary teacher, a secondary teacher, a social studies teacher that's going to bring writing into their class, or a science teacher. Kids need to write. We need to teach. Teaching is not a dirty word. There's many things that kids can learn from us, and so I have no hesitation about mentioning that as an important thing. We need to support kids. They're not at the end of their journey. They'll actually never be at the end of their journey. Just like I need support when I write, I need feedback, I need help from my wife who's a better writer, kids need that as well. We need to connect, and I'll say what I mean by that a little bit later, and we need to create, and I'll say what I mean by that a little bit later as well. But let's take this first point that I mentioned here on write. So, you know, it was a dark and stormy night, the most famous line in American literature. So I'll use a couple of cartoons throughout and some things that kids have written as kind of lead-ins. You know, the whole purpose of what we do, if we're going to be involved in writing, is for kids to write. That's the game. It's like, I love basketball. I used to be a high school basketball player. You know, the drills were okay, and I did them because I got to play in the game. And so that's our most important thing, and it's the most important thing I can say today. If all you're doing is teaching, then you don't have a writing program. And I suspect that's not the case for anybody here. But it's also important what kids write. So we want to be sure as often as possible, I'd love to say 100% of the time, I've been a teacher, I know that it doesn't always work 100% of the time. We want to have real purposes and real audiences. And I'm going to use a word I hate, authentic. We want to have authentic purposes. I don't like it because it's overused. But when kids see a real purpose in doing it and they're driven by that, my experience is teachers can get out of the way. The kids drive that car themselves and they do a really good job of it. This is where the red comes in. So the red here is don't assume that this is sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And you'll notice there's no green up here. I'm not giving you a percentile jump. If you guys were all elementary school teachers, I'd be telling you that there's about a 10 to 12 percentile jump in writing quality and reading comprehension as a result of increasing how much time, 45 minutes a week, that kids write. We don't know at the secondary level. The research is so poorly done that we haven't been able to calculate an effect size, and there's very little research. So this is a personal opinion on this, but I don't see how we can have writing programs without it. Yes, Carol?
Are you saying that if elementary teachers add 45 more minutes a week, or they just have kids write 45 minutes a week?
So the way this works is if they add about 45 minutes. So all the studies, the kind of design has been what happens when you add time. Okay. What we don't know very well is how much time teachers spend teaching. We do know that, say at the elementary level, from national surveys we've done, teachers say they spend about 20 minutes during the whole day writing in primary grades, and about 25 in grades 4 to 6. We don't have comparable levels at the middle school and high school level, but to be really frank, we ask other questions on this. The 4 most common writing activities across about 8 national surveys we've done, middle and high school level, fill in the blanks is number 1, you know, in some kind of activity. Write a one sentence answers to questions on homework assignments is number 2. Writing list is number 3. These are not things that you normally think of as connected writing. I'm not saying they don't have a purpose, but when we get to number 4, it's summary writing of things that you've read. But things that you might be thinking about, like persuasive writing, writing a report, writing explanations. You know, I'm going from what teachers tell us. We don't see a lot of that. And my guess is I'm probably overplaying what happens because I send you a survey. You're smart. You don't want to say to me you're not doing anything. And so at least nationally, we don't see much. Now, I suspect most of you are National Writing Project teachers. I'd be stunned if you were writing back saying that to me. A couple of things here, and again, remember, this is more opinion than it is evidence. I think at the secondary level, at a minimum, kids need to write an hour a day. Now, that doesn't mean that you slavishly follow an hour a day. I walk for an hour every day, and I slavishly follow that rule, because I'm afraid if I stop walking for a couple of days, I'll stop walking completely. But this is kind of on average, and I'm not saying that this is, the maximum, but the minimum. The other thing that's really important here, and now you will see a little bit of green there, is that we want to look for ways at the secondary level to make writing a part of the learning process. I mean, that all obviously includes reading as well. These are tools that we use conjointly to help us learn. And they're integral tools, along with talking, that help us understand and get a better handle and advance our knowledge on the kinds of things that we're learning. And we just completed a meta-analysis taking a look at this. We get equal effects in science, social studies, and mathematics when we have kids write about materials that they're learning. Now, there is a little bit of a kicker on this. When we look at procedures that are just recording information in terms of this, like filling out a graphic organizer or doing a journal entry where you're just saying the things that were presented in class, we don't get an effect. So it's analysis and interpretation that Judith Langer and Arthur Appleby has said to us, 40 years or running at this point.
Steve?
Yes?
Did the 15 mean 15 minutes?
No, I'm sorry.
What did it mean?
Thank you. So the green here means that there's a 15% jump. I just didn't want to, every time it comes up, say 15. Yeah, no, that's fine. But if you had that question, you can bet somebody else had it. And so I welcome those kind of things. Thank you. So the second thing I'd like to talk about is teach. Now, what I'm going to share with you is what we have some evidence from research on teaching. It doesn't mean that it's everything that kids need to learn, okay? But these are things that we know, at least in research studies, have had a positive effect on the quality of what students write. And so the one that I want to first share with you, and I do this a little hesitantly because this has got a large jump, and I've got it first. And you remember what I said before about Carol nailing me about this before. But we have quite a bit of evidence that if you teach kids strategies or process, or you teach process around the writing, on how to write, there's a strong impact in terms of writing quality, and there's a greater likelihood that kids will engage in those processes when you're not there and teaching them. And so you'll also see a little thing down here, don't pee in the classroom. I'd love to say this was mine, this is my wife's, and I'll explain it a little bit better, but as a heads up, don't post strategies, explain, even model, and then expect that students will have mastered them. And in middle school and high school, that's particularly important because the kinds of strategic processing that you're hoping kids engage in are a lot more sophisticated than, say, something like brainstorming we might do in kindergarten or first grade. So in terms of thinking about this, I'd like to break it down a little bit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You guys know what the writing process is now. I just have that up there as a reference. But a way of thinking about strategies is that they are mental and physical operations that one engages in to help them accomplish a task. So they can be general, like when you do a semantic web, or they can be very specific and help you with something like persuasive writing. And they might focus in on reasons and counter reasons as an example of this. I also want to point out here, they can be algorithmic. I don't think I said that right. They can work within an algorithm, or they can be heuristics. So they can be very specific in terms of the processes that you go through, or they can be much more general in terms of taking you through a set of processes with more openness in terms of how you apply them. And I'd like to give an example of one that we've used with middle school students in some of our studies, and there's upgraded versions of this for older students. And I'll give you a little bit of background on it as well. So we did this with 6th and 7th grade kids. And my basic idea initially, and this was done with one of my former students, Sue De La Paz, the basic idea initially is I had this really dumb idea. I thought if we got kids to think about a topic from a lot of different sides before they wrote on it, then they would make a reasoned decision about which side they wanted to take. Oh, what a fool I was. Because, you know, I don't even do that. Most of us don't do that. You know, if we have an opinion, it's hard to get us to shift and change. So why would you expect in one writing thing that that would take place? But the first thing that we ask them to do, and I don't think they do this really well, but it still works, is we ask them to suspend judgment. And so basically this is a planning strategy to help you generate ideas and make evaluations about which ones you're going to use and do some pre-structuring on how you're going to write that out. This is not uncommon. This is not an uncommon strategy from what some professionals do, but not all, because we have a great deal of diversity in how people write professionally. So we ask kids to suspend judgments either individually, with other kids as a whole class, with materials that they're looking at. What they do is they generate ideas on both sides or 3 sides or 4 sides of an argument that they're going to be dealing with. And then what we do is we ask them to take a side. So that's the T in this. And at that point, what I realized is that they already picked the same side they were at before. But then we ask them to organize their ideas. So now they've generated a lot of ideas, but they want to write something that's convincing or that's going to persuade somebody else. So we ask them to look at the ideas they've generated, and they can keep adding as they go, but we ask them to pick at least 3. And the reason that we did at least 3, there's nothing magic about 3, is we wanted to make sure there was something on the plate that they thought would be the most convincing argument for their audience. And then we asked them to look at the other side and pick at least 2 or 3 that they were going to try to refute. And there's a lot of rich discussion about this when you're doing it with kids together. And then you'll notice the last step of this is that we ask them to keep planning and thinking as they write. Because our experience is when we've taught kids strategies, if it's a planning strategy, they stop planning very much, except for at the sentence level, once they have their ideas in play. And of course, you know, when you write, a lot of times some of your best ideas come as you're composing. And so this would be an example that sits somewhere between a heuristic and an algorithm in terms of a strategy. Also, it's been pretty evident that if we want kids to learn strategies, we'd like for them to have these as something they can use independently without our help. And so I just have a little picture up there, you know, kind of with the gradual release model. I'm going to make the assumption everybody knows what that is. We talk about the strategy. Sometimes in our work, we talk with kids about what they currently do. We share the strategy. We talk about how it's a little bit different. We talk about why we'd like them to try it out and the reason it might help them. Then we model how to do it with them helping us in terms of generating the essay. And we might do that several times, releasing control. And then they start doing it with a peer to them doing it without our help. And we're constantly trying to withdraw any aid that we're giving to them on this. But there's also reflection throughout in good strategy instruction. So as an example of this, when we get to our endpoint, we're talking to kids about how to modify this, because they already start to do that to make it more effective for them. And we also look for ways of getting them to use it in other situations, which means they're going to have to modify it if it's going to work. And then finally, kind of with the last point here on strategy instruction, when we teach kids strategies, and sometimes they can be very simple things like goal setting, okay? When we teach them various strategies, we want them to use these things flexibly. And so in a sense, and I'll steal this from Carol, because Carol was talking earlier about using the concept of a toolkit, stealing it from John Hayes and Linda Flowers, so I'm going to steal it from her. You know, kids have a lot of different things, some that they create, some schemas that, you know, they learn at school, but we want them to use those smartly, intelligently, appropriate to the task. Some of that happens naturally, but we can facilitate that as well. And so that's an important part of this. So when I said don't pee in the classroom, you got to go beyond modeling if you want to get the maximum effects out of this. Okay, I love this story. I walked last night on Balboa Island, and I was walking along the water part. And so think about this as being a kid that lives on Balboa Island, right along the water in those beautiful homes. So when a child in an affluent neighborhood was asked to write a story about a poor family, she chose her own, and this is her story. Well, maybe it's not her story. Now it decides to work. Okay. So once upon a time, there was a poor family. The father was poor, the mother was poor, the children were poor, the nannies were poor, the poo man was poor, and the personal trainer was poor. And before you think this is a made-up story, it is not. Now, you know, obviously I'm kind of having a laugh at the content in the story, but that's not the focal point for me. Look at the sentences. Every sentence is the same. It's a repetitive set of sentences. I mean, even if the content's ludicrous, this is really a very poorly written composition. And so one of the things that I would like to also emphasize, and it's not emphasized in Common Core, for example, is we want kids to become facile with sentences, that they can use sentences to convey their intended ideas in a form that's understandable by their reader and doesn't have a lot of or any mistakes in it as much as possible. And I'll say why in a few seconds on this latter part. So I'll say something about doing that, but you'll also see another red down here. Don't teach grammar using traditional procedures. So I'll come back to this in a second, but what do I mean here? So we tell kids, this is a definition of, say, an adjective. I'll take something simple. And then what we do is we give them practice either selecting an adjective out of 3 to go in a sentence slot, or they put in one. And then we're stunned when they can't do that in their own writing. So we have better ways of approaching this. So I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. So in terms of teaching sentences, this has been around since the 1980s. We have a reasonable amount of research that says if you model for kids how to combine sentences, and you make clear your thinking about it, and you provide practice, guided practice in doing that, and then even better, they take it to their own writing, which I think is essential in terms of developing skills, we see a couple of things happen. Their sentences get more complex because we're helping them learn and apply more complex sentences. Their grammar skills get better. We see fewer grammar miscues. Their usage skills tend to get better because, you know, we're doing stuff with capitalization and punctuation in these sentences. And the quality of their writing gets better. Now you might say, what? Well, this takes up a lot of cognitive resources. Think about yourself. When you write, I'd be willing to bet that about 90% of your thinking time is at the sentence level. Now, I may be overestimating by a little bit, but you know, you have your general plans and things that you're going to do, and things occur to you, but the real struggle is getting your words onto paper in the right vessel to say what you want. And so you're never going to make this automatic. We don't want to do that, but we'd like to be facile and thoughtful in terms of doing that. So it's a cognitive load issue in part. Once kids get more facile at this, it reduces the cognitive load, and there's resources for other kinds of things. Now, let me come back to the grammar thing. So why, you know, when Writing Next came out, the Carnegie Corporation asked us basically to bury the grammar findings because what we had was a negative effect. for grammar instruction. Doesn't mean that grammar instruction actually had a negative effect. It meant whatever it was compared to in terms of improving writing quality got better. But there was another review by a man from England named Andrews who also found in a different way that there was no effect in terms of improving grammar or sentence construction skills for this type of work. And so the first thing that the papers picked up on, first paper I picked up and read is Writing Next says teachers don't need to teach grammar. And you know, I was stunned. I'd really kind of put that into discussion somewhere. You know, I wasn't happy about doing that, but they were the sponsors of that. It was still there, and the first thing that they picked up was that. So we did a meta-analysis a couple of years ago, and here's something we found out. Presentation effects make a difference. What we found is that when we took a look and say we had 100 papers, and we judged them in terms of quality, we ranked them from, you know, the one that kind of sat on the bottom in terms of quality of ideas to the best in terms of our viewpoint. And we pulled out number 50, 50th percentile. And we took that, you know, this is not as pertinent to you guys, but I want to give you a sense of the three presentation effects. And we rewrote it with handwriting that was very easy to read or difficult but readable. It had a full standard deviation effect. That 50th paper went all the way to number 16, and we hadn't changed a word. Spelling miscues and grammar miscues dropped at about half that distance. So, you know, we think sometimes that we don't need to deal with this because it doesn't matter, but people form judgments about the quality of what you have to say when those things are evident. Now, I'm not saying you need to have a writing program that's based on grammar, but it needs to be part of what you're taking a look at. And so think about the adjective example I gave before. A different way of approaching that, we could approach it through sentence combining, but a different way is having kids help us define what an adjective is by structuring that conversation and asking for describing words of person, places, and things, then coming up with a definition for ourselves, then us modeling how to use adjectives in a sentence, them practicing it, and then them going to their writing and looking for places to do it, with the caveat that Mark Twain once said, when you catch an adjective, kill it, because you can overdo this thing. So I wanted to be sure to say something about grammar to make up for my past error of hiding that. Also, we don't have much evidence on this, but obviously having the right words to convey your idea is important. And there's an effect for doing this, but we don't know a lot about how to do it. There's been three ways. One is you spend a lot of time teaching what are called tier 2 words. They're not words that kids will automatically know the meaning of, but they're words that are a little less common, but not so uncommon that they're unlikely to be used in their writing. Another way of approaching this, and this is something that we've done, is that you work on vocabulary around the genre you're working on. So for example, we worked on mystery writing with kids in 6th grade, so right at the start of middle school. And what we did was, as we read some mysteries, short mysteries to begin with, and as we did, we developed vocabulary around concepts like red herring. And so what that did is that not only increased vocabulary about the genre, but it pulled in knowledge with it. And that had a positive effect in terms of students writing. And then something that other people have done is, if they're doing something on outer space, for example, they might do some vocabulary lessons there. But this is the area in some ways that it seems like from a research perspective, we're least advanced on. I love this. I have a dog, by the way. This is a spelling miscue. You know, it should have been Pavlov studied this salivation of dogs, but when I saw this kid had written this, I thought, I'm keeping that. Because I think it would be great if the dog and I went to heaven together, if, you know, and we were knocking on St. Peter's door. But this is here for a reason. I'm not suggesting that you teach the mechanics of writing to kids that are at the middle school and high school level. But I want to be really clear about this. You're going to have kids who struggle with these skills, and it's going to have an impeding effect on their use of planning, sentence construction. They take up unnecessary resources, and they interfere with content generation as well. So for some of you, you're going to be thinking about, you're going to have kids in 11th and 12th grade who really struggle in terms of getting words down on paper, and sometimes 1 out of every 4 words is misspelled. So we have to have alternatives for dealing with this, and we do some on the technological end, which I'll talk about later. But these problems don't necessarily go away for all kids. And for some kids with disabilities, they're there throughout the school years. And so it's part of our job, at least I feel, that we keep this in mind and we try to minimize the way that these can affect kids. Okay, support. I suspect these writers below could have used some support. With all the uses to be made of rubber, it was necessary to find a substitute. After all, rubber does not grow on trees. And I've seen this second one in many forms. The French flag is 1/2 white, 1/2 red, and 1/2 blue. So obviously this isn't a writing problem, it's a math one. My favorite on this is I saw a kid write, Galileo was a famous astronomer. He was half Italian, half French, and half German. And then he said he was very large. And so I guess so. So in terms of types of things that we have some evidence on support, these are not all the things because I don't have like an unlimited time here. But one of the things is obviously feedback, assessing students' writing and giving them feedback. Now I also want to say on this, it's not just writing that we want to give feedback on, it's learning. In terms of as they're making progress or we're teaching things, we need to have that teacher's eye out to see how things are going and make adjustments as needed. But I also have a don't here. And I have to be really clear about the don't. This is an experience thing, not a research thing, okay? We don't want to give too much feedback. In fact, there's a movement in the US now of teachers, particularly secondary teachers, who are talking about limiting how much feedback on an individual paper you give. So I'll give an example of this. When I was in college, I almost flunked out in my junior year. I got an F in French, and I lived 6.5 years in France, so don't ask. I got a D in composition studies course. So it's not looking like a good career in writing for me. I burned that French book and the paper I got from the composition course in my backyard. That paper looked like it had been in Psycho. It had been stabbed so many times that red just bled everywhere. Quite honestly, I couldn't handle the feedback. I actually left that, and I'm a pretty self-efficacious person. I felt for 5 years I could not write. I mean, literally, if somebody said, "Are you a writer? Can you write? Are you a good writer?" the answer would have been, "You got to be kidding me." Now, usually you don't have those kind of reactions to one kind of feedback, but too much feedback can be overwhelming for kids. Also, too little praise doesn't get us what we want either. Now, this is someplace that we do have some research on. It's from the single participant area, but we do have research that says when you say to kids, "This is what you liked and why," they're more likely to do that in the future if that's something that you want to promote. Plus, it's a much better way to start off in terms of giving feedback to be on a positive foot. And obviously, we don't want to negate ownership, students' ownership when we give feedback. So one of the things I really like about the National Writing Project and the kinds of ways you approach giving feedback is it's not taking ownership of that writing piece away from students. It's often used through questions that are leading questions or open-ended questions. So we're not saying, "Do this." Sometimes we do that, but often we don't, and we shouldn't, in my opinion. In terms of thinking about this, I'm going to mention 3 kinds of feedback, but I only have 2 up there. When we give feedback, I have a 29% percentile point there. We actually know more about giving feedback amongst peers in some ways from a research perspective than we do about adults, which is really stunning because this is one of our oldest tools. So when we give feedback as adults to kids, we have a positive effect. When we teach peers, and this is the important thing, teach peers how to give feedback to each other, we have a positive effect as well. None of the studies that were included in our reviews involve just saying to kids, give Johnny over here feedback, give Sue feedback, give Alfonso feedback. They structured the situation so that it was a positive event and there wasn't that much feedback being given, and the criteria were really clear to kids. Also, if we teach kids to give feedback to themselves, it has a positive effect. Now, I particularly like this bottom one, even though the effect sizes are not as large, because ultimately we want kids to be critics of their own writing. That's what we do when we write. We're critical of it. We analyze it. We think about it. And so this is one way to move down that road with kids. Now, I said there's one that's not up there. That's use of computer technology. So the effect sizes are about 10 percentile point jump in the data that we have now. And so, sometimes when I say this, and it's sometimes a particularly difficult conversation when I speak to English teachers about this, because, you're right. Computers don't give the same feedback that you do, okay? They can't read this composition like you do, but when we base it on human scorings that are fairly reliable, it looks pretty good and it's getting better. So I don't think it's quite there where we'd like yet, but in the future, I suspect 20 years from now, when my dog and I are in heaven, you guys, when you write, and the kids that you're working with write, computers are going to be more of a companion and partner in this process. And in fact, I'll say this now instead of saying it later, we've done some projects where we've taken a look at ramped up word processors that give students help with planning, vocabulary. You can get feedback easily. It doesn't have automated essay scoring in it, but you can easily get feedback because it's a digital tool from peers or teachers, and it has various supports through it. We get 3 times the effects with those kind of programs than what we do with just word processing alone. So I think this is going to be, I guess the other way of putting it, this train's left the station. Whether we like it or not, it's going to be part of our future. Also, this one's the simplest thing I can say to you today. You provide clear goals for what you want in writing, you'll get it, or more likely get it. So what's the first question that your kids ask you when you assign a paper to them?
How long is it after?
How long, if it's I knew I was going to do that, it's just a matter of time. How many references, etc. Now, actually it's very intelligent behavior on your part. All writing tasks are ill-defined problems. And so what they're asking you to do is a means-ends analysis. They're asking you to tell you what you want. And if you already know what you want, why hide it? Let them know. If you want them to deal with both sides of an argument or 3 sides of an argument, tell them that. That may be enough to get them down that road. If you want them to deal with substantive kinds of things in revising, they don't have enough content, one of the things we found that works is to tell them, I'd like you to add 3 new ideas to your paper. Now, sometimes they just add them at the end, and they don't integrate them in. We had a study where we asked kids to take stories that they were writing, and they had to add a new character, or they changed the time frame. So we had a number of these things, and we wanted to see if there was a generalization to more substantive behavior when they didn't have those goals. 2 out of every 10 kids beat us on this. So you'd have a statement at the end that said, oh yes, and Johnny was in the story. That wasn't our intention, but they didn't put the effort into it. So it was part our fault, but I also, they weren't as interested in the task. So be clear about what you want. It's also helpful to get kids to be clear about what they want to do in their writing. So this goes both ways. Basically writing is a goal-setting kind of procedure. And so we want kids to learn how to set their own goals for writing And initially, for kids who have trouble with that, it can start by you giving them, instead of one goal, multiple goals to choose from, and then start leaving something out so they start putting in their own. I love Calvin and Hobbes, and I particularly love this cartoon. What am I going to do about this report on bats? You got to help me, Hobbes. Okay, first, let's make a list of what we know. Yeah, that's a good way to start. And it is, but you know that this is going to go downhill. Number one, what are bats? They're bugs, right? Yeah, put that down. Are you sure? They fly, right? They're ugly and hairy, right? Come on, this is taking all day. So this is kind of a negative lead into something that I think is very important, and that's peers working together. And so when we have peers working together around process, there's a positive effect when they write alone later. So when we engage them in this over a period of time, and it's structured in a way that they know what they're doing, and there's some rules around how you interact with your peers, it makes you a better writer. Because what happens is you learn from working with others. I mean, that's one of the most powerful learning tools that we have. Now, I already said this, don't assume that this will be effective without providing guidance and instruction in how to do so. So I'm going to share another story that is kind of a dumb Steve story. The first time I ever did any peer revising, we always try stuff out with kids first before we take it on the road and try it with a larger group of kids. And this was something I was actually doing with 6th grade kids, 2 kids who had been classified by the school as having a learning disability. And I asked both of them to write something about what they had done. This is a terrible topic. Over their winter vacation, it's kind of like the summer vacation, the dreaded summer vacation topic. And I thought, if I just have the kids read their papers to each other and they exchange them, they can give feedback on it, it'd all be hunky-dory. Well, the young lady read her story, and I said, hey, what'd you think? And he looks at the girl and says, that stunk. And so she threw her paper down and went out the room. It was after school, and I took my little black box, if you'd like to think of it that way, and went home and thought, oh my God, maybe I need to get another job. But I thought through it, and I went back 2 days later and I apologized to her. And I said, I'd like to try something different. That was my fault. I should have structured this a little bit. And so what we did is, I said, we practiced this a little bit. I'm going to read something to you, and then you look at it yourself. And any place that you think it needs more information, because both of these kids weren't generating a lot of information, put a caret. And any place that you think is unclear, put a question mark. And then what we did was we talked about how to give feedback, and I modeled and she practiced, so it was a conversation. And so when he read his story to her, she said, I loved that you went over Christmas break on a skiing trip in Vermont. I've always wanted to learn how to ski. So she started on a positive note. And she said, but I didn't quite understand here how you got there. And so it was this conversation as they went down the line where she would interpose something positive, but then something that led to a question. And then ultimately he did what he wanted with the paper, because it was his paper. But a little bit of structuring made a whole world of difference in terms of this working. Okay, 21st century writing tools. I've kind of addressed this, but take a look at that. You get about, what's that, say 18? Because I can't quite see it here. 18 or 13? 18. So if you move kids from word processors, away from pencils to word processors, and you do this for about 6 months to 9 months, the quality of their writing gets better. And that's also when they write with paper and pencil. And so, why? Why would that happen? Well, it's easier to do things on computers. Plus, they give you some help around grammar and spell checkers. Remember what I said earlier, with some of these new kind of tools that are out now, we're seeing, it's not a lot of studies, but a triple effect. And so we're going to see more and more of this, but you guys have a challenge. So I was in Australia where I work in the summer 2 years ago, and I came around a curb, and there were about 90 adolescents. And I looked up, and everybody was speaking, but nobody was directly speaking to each other. And I thought, oh my God, if this had been 20 years ago, I'd have stepped on another planet. But take a look at what we can do with phones now, with speech to text. So we can say, and it comes out as writing. And so the question is that the same thing as writing? I don't have to decide that, you do. But that's going to become more and more common, and we see it more and more often now. And so it's going to mean that you have to think about what that means in terms of your instruction. So an example I sometimes give is think about the dictaphone. So this is a little different, okay? Because with a dictaphone you can't see what you're writing, but studies done in the 1960s and 1950s found that people who used dictaphones spent 60% of their time planning in advance. So one of the things as we move more to tools that allow us to speak to text, we may find that planning is more important. I'm not sure what it's going to be, but I guarantee you for every affordance, there's going to be some unintended consequences that we're going to need to deal with. And so that's going to be one of your challenges as we move forward. We also want to connect. And so what do I mean by that? So in this case, what I'm really talking about, I could have put learning here as well, connecting, reading, writing, learning, and talking, but I wanted to keep this just to reading. And I'm just going to talk about this from the point of view of writing to reading, but I could go the other way and I could go combined on this. I mean, we have considerable evidence that we've collected in meta-analysis that support every one of those directions. But so here's some of the things that we find. When you use writing as a tool for thinking about what you're reading, or even to record it. Remember before I said recording wasn't that great of a thing, but at least in terms of looking at it for reading comprehension, what we found was that if you generate questions, your own questions, and answer them in writing, that has a positive effect. When you take notes in terms of stuff you're reading, that has a positive effect. Usually that's with instruction on how to take notes that involves organizing your ideas. If you write a summary, that has a positive effect. If you take information you're learning and turn it into a narrative, that has positive effects. Taking a point of view and defending it has a positive effect. And talking about or writing about how you apply something has a positive effect. So I'm sure that there are other things that do as well. Those are the things that have some support in the literature. Also, using reading to support writing, model text, that's our second oldest thing. Feedback and model text, 2,000 years or older. When we have kids, we ask them to look at and emulate and use as a model text that we think is particularly good. It has a positive effect. And this stuff is underpowered because in these studies, all they did was give kids a text and say, use this as a model. That's really lousy instruction. What if we would have looked at it, analyzed it, talked about it, and then they wrote something? My guess is we'd have even better effects. Also, providing feedback. When you give feedback to others, it has a positive effect on your own writing. We've done some studies where we've looked really carefully at what happens to kids who give feedback to other kids. We start to see that feedback showing up in their first drafts of their composition because they start to internalize the criteria that they're using. And then the other thing that may seem a little surprising, observing readers as they read and try to apply something that's written. So it's the apply part that's important here. That also can have a positive effect in terms of your writing. All these studies come out, except for one out of Europe, but they've been very interested in what happens if you write like something like directions and then you see what happens. Or you write a persuasive text and then you see people discussing it. And so that can have a positive effect also in terms of your writing. Okay, the last thing, and Carol, have I run over time or am I okay? Because this is fairly short. There's two things here on create. So I'm talking about, and I could have led with this and felt completely comfortable with it. I probably wouldn't have led with the three in the middle. I'd either lead with writing or this. We want to create classrooms in which students can take risks. Really what I'm talking about here is we want to create a supportive writing environment, okay? So one of the things in that is, and this is all from the study of exceptional literacy teachers teaching reading and writing. one of the things that we saw as a consistent thing in our metasynthesis is they encourage students to be self-reliant. They did not do for students what they could do for themselves. I'm not saying they never did that, but that seemed to be one of the themes that came up over and over again in those things. Another thing that we saw in terms of those is that they were very good about being sensitive to the individual needs of kids in terms of writing. They adapted, not only writing assignments, but writing instruction. And you know, I don't have anything up here that's talking about personalization or individualizing instruction because it's such a difficult thing for those of us who have been teachers. It's really, you know, it's really important, but it's really hard to do. But you saw these exceptional teachers making the adjustments to help everybody be as good of a writer as possible. Another thing is that they set high expectations for their kids, that all kids are going to be moving forward, and they pressed the envelope a little bit. So they set high expectations, but they were realistic, but they tended to push that envelope out. They challenged kids to do things outside of their comfort zone. You know, our tendency sometimes is to stay in that comfort zone. And another thing is they taught kids the routines that would be successful in their class, because learning to write and writing in a community in part is all about these routines. And then finally, we want to promote a community of writers and learners. And you'll see that there is an effect size or a percentile thing up there. This is the process writing approach. Now, you know, I put it in the service to this last thing. It actually involves more than creating a community, but it's a major part of this. And so one of the things I love about the National Writing Project is you're a member of that community as a writer. You know, the idea is that kids don't see you as something distinct. I mean, they're going to see you as a teacher, but they also see you as a writer because you bring your writing into class. You talk about your writing. So you're a part of that community. What I'm really saying here in one way is don't function as a grader and an evaluator. If that's your whole function, then we've missed the boat to some degree on this. We want to be not only a teacher and a mentor, but we also want to be a member of the community that we create. Thank you guys very much.
Okay, I'm going to introduce our panel to you. But before I do that, I also wanted to welcome our live stream audience. We have people that are viewing the talk today remotely, and we invite them to send questions in to Hui if you'd like to participate in asking questions. I also wanted to acknowledge two other people involved in the Wright Center. Nicole Gilbertson, who's the director of the UCI History Project, is one of our consultants, and Catherine Dao, the co-director of the Writing Project, is also helping us. We are working as a group to design a new writing intervention for teaching argument writing in history. And our advisory board, this amazing group of people, is helping us to create a vision for how to make that happen. So you've met Steve. Next to Steve is Judith Langer. Judith is a distinguished professor at the University of New York, Albany. She has been so instrumental in everything we know about instructional scaffolding, the author of so many books, Envisioning Writing, Writing Instruction That Works, and we're really honored to have all these guys here. Next to Judith is Carol Jago. Many of you saw Carol's live stream event this summer. She is the Associate Director of the California Reading and Literature Project, the former President of the National Council of Teachers of English, and the author of more books than I could possibly name, but the newest one is a book about books. Next to her is Mary Schleppagral. Mary is a professor in education studies at the University of Michigan. Many of you may know her work with English learners. She's very well known for the work she does in that area. And next to her is Chauncey Montesano, an associate professor in the same department at the University of Michigan, whose specialty is really argument writing. And the two of them shared with us in a meeting today some curriculum they've been designing for middle school for argument writing and history that is just totally awesome. So when we do our wine and cheese, if you want to ask them about their website where you can go to get all kinds of cool materials, please do that. Next in line is Jennifer Fletcher. Jennifer is a professor of humanities at Cal State Monterey Bay. You may know her 2 books on argument writing. Jennifer will be with us for our December conference, and we will live stream her workshop on argument writing to a virtual audience. We're happy to have her. Next to Jennifer is Cindy Greenleaf. Cindy is a senior project scientist at WestEd. You may know her work for the Strategic Literacy Initiative and her book Reading for Understanding. She's also the principal investigator of a gargantuan IES grant on reading in the content areas writ large that she's been dealing with. And next to Cindy is none other than the very eminent David Pearson, former dean of the School of Education, Graduate School of Education at UC Berkeley, the originator of the gradual release of responsibility, and the author of hundreds of books about reading comprehension and reading instruction. So kind of an awesome crew. We learned so much from them today, and they've really been helping us to shape this vision. And I hope you guys will take the opportunity that you have to ask whatever burning questions. To start us off, just to get us going, I'm going to ask the first one, and I'm going to throw it out to the whole group and just see who wants to bite. And that is that Steve addressed all this number of research-based best practices in his opening talk. And I wonder if any of you want to add something that Steve did not mention that you think is very important for this group of teachers and educators to think about, or if you want to stress or reinforce anything to say this is really paramount. So who would like to take that opportunity?
Well, I'll pick up on one. It's something that Steve said, but I want to reinforce it, and that is that we usually think of reading as grist for the writing mill, but Steve and his colleagues have done a wonderful meta-analysis showing the impact of writing on reading, and we forget about that relationship too, that writing really can be a way of helping reading. And for me, I don't even understand what I read about a text until I write it down, and when I write it down, my understanding changes from what it was impressionistically when I sort of responded to it. And the other thing that I want to say is that I think that just the process of writing is a way of revising your comprehension.
I'd add just again to echo what Steve said about having students talk about their writing. But again, it doesn't just happen. We need to model the language of metacognition, of reflection about your own practice, even giving them the vocabulary to talk about what they're seeing, not only in someone else's writing or in a mentor text, but in their own.
I'll try one.
Writing.
Is this on? I want to underscore your last point, Steve, about teachers as members of the community of writers, and I think we need to extend that to teachers as members of the community of inquirers, the community of readers, the community of investigators. If we're working in the disciplines, that can be very discipline specific, but that membership modeling and sort of vulnerability and risk and it's sort of walking the talk of the kind of work that you want your students to engage in and value. the hallmark of the writing project, but something that can be very broadly, metaphorically moved out to lots of components of target practices we want students to take up.
I just want to bring up the whole notion of how writing shapes thinking. And that is extraordinarily important for us to remember all of the time. The kind of writing that we ask students to do, the particular kind, gives them a way into thinking about the material at hand in certain ways and not other ways. And we need to think about that, and we need to think about what our goal for the writing is, so that we know that they will be thinking about the content in ways that we think are efficacious to that particular lesson or that particular set of activities. And let me give you just a couple of examples that I think will be helpful. One is that, Steve brought this up, short, quick writing that is simply recording, taking things down, and in a way, they're like taking quick notes, facts, just writing them, getting them down. We ordinarily would think of as not being helpful. On the one hand, what we find, though, is that doing that helps students learn individual facts more quickly and remember them for a short period of time. Okay? So if you want them to learn something fast and not keep it very long, and it's facts, cramming like that, but the act of writing those quick little things is helpful. Let me give you another extreme. If you ask students to be able to write in a way that totally compares, goes beyond it, and conceives and transforms their understanding of what the material is that you're studying, it takes longer. They deal with much more information, right? It's a more difficult thing for you to help them learn to do, but they remember it longer. And it becomes theirs, part of their longer-term memory. They're able to deal with it in a deeper way for a longer period of time. Those are just extreme examples. But the point is we can give students different kinds of activities because they're appropriate for what our goals are. And we can think about what those kinds of writings are that might be most efficacious before we even begin to write. You know, what are these early kind of brainstorming things? Why are we doing them? And for what purpose? Again, all the way through an entire writing process.
So do you mind if I say one thing?
One thing, and then we'll go to someone else in the audience.
So everybody was really nice. But I think there are some things, and I'll just mention one that could be added, and I didn't speak about it because of the type of work we looked at, and that's a limitation. But making connections with writing out of school, I think, is very important, because we have kids who do, I mean, they don't think of it as writing, but they do a lot of writing out of school now. And one way of maybe making writing more motivating for them in school is to have better connections between the two.
Okay, we have a question from the live stream. This is Greg from Oregon, and he's directing it to Dr. Fletcher. Why is argument writing so important?
Let me just see.
Wow, hello, Oregon. You know, argument is how we do our work in academic contexts, in professional contexts, in civic contexts. It's how we understand, you know, what the problem is, what's already been done by others to try to solve it, how we can make an effective contribution. So it's really argument as inquiry and problem solving. And so it's not so much about how you can win, but how you can understand and how you can help.
Okay, thank you. Do we have anybody in the audience who'd like to ask a question?
Can I add something to that? It's culturally, this depends on the culture. So in China, arguing is not the same in writing as it is in the US. It's circular. Sometimes it'll never say what the actual point is, and sometimes it'll walk all the way around. So, you know, we live in there's a book called the I'm going to get this wrong, the argument society. A lot of the Western world lives in an argument society, but that's not the case necessarily in all cultures.
I have a question for David Pearson. What is the role of reading in effective writing?
I alluded to that in my earlier answer, but there's a couple of other roles. So the first role for reading with respect to effective writing is to serve as grist for the writing mill. And you know what I like to think about of reading is that, you know, we all know about the impact that knowledge has on both reading and writing. But you remember that the thing about reading is that today's new knowledge that you gain from reading is tomorrow's prior knowledge that you use in reading and writing. So we forget that reading is also an opportunity. You know, knowledge is both cause of comprehension, but it's also the consequence of comprehension. And we forget about that role, I think, sometimes. And the other is to be ready to do what I said earlier, and that is to be the recipient of what writing does to anchor your comprehension and your knowledge. You know, I don't know about you, but I don't really know what I know until I write about it, because when I talk about it, I'm very easy on myself. And I have these conversations with myself and with other people, and all the time I'm saying, you know what I mean? And you know what I mean means that I don't really know what I mean. But you've been there before, and you can imagine what it is that I mean. But in writing, it looks right back at you. And it argues with you. And that's so important for both understanding and knowledge acquisition.
I have something I'd like to ask, following up on something that Steve said about technology. And that is this summer, when we had Kelly Gallagher meeting with us, one of the things he said was that both he and Penny Kittle like to have some of the work that students do written by hand, particularly if they're working in book clubs or if they're doing expressive writing, and that he felt that the kind of thinking that you do when you're writing by hand is different than when you're on the computer, and sometimes the students were more thoughtful when they had a chance to do some planning writing by hand. So I wanted to throw that out to any of you to respond. Carol?
I think that that's exactly the kind of conversation we need to have with students. Some of them will find that to be the case. Others will say, "No, I just give me my phone and I'll write a novel." You know, so I just want kids to talk about this and to think about what works best for them.
Lizzie? Okay.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to kind of piggyback on what Carol just asked, and so I'd like to come back to a question that Steve posed but didn't answer in his talk, and I'd like to kind of throw it out to the panel to see what you think, which was about speech-to-text apps. Is it writing? Steve asked, and then he said he wasn't going to answer that. So I'd like to I'd like to pose that question to the panel and get your views on that. Speech to text, is it writing?
I'll start. I think it's literacy. And I think that that's the bigger thing that I think we need to think about. I think that it's the literate use of language to be able to create communication, to be able to create text, be it oral text or written text or musical text or what have you. So I think that subsumed under literacy, I would say yes, writing does play a role.
So I'm just going to, I actually think it is. But, you know, it depends on the purpose. And so my wife now is using Dragon Naturally Speaking for all of her emails and for some of her writing. I'm waiting for the day when all I have to think and it goes to the page. Because I'm one of these guys who type looking down at the thing, so I would really like to be like this. So the next best thing is it goes from here to there. But I say that, and I don't really know what challenges that's going to create for me as a writer because, quite honestly, the fact that I'm a slow typist, it's frustrating sometimes, but it also gives me a little bit of space to look back over what I'm doing. And so, what I might like might not be the best thing for me.
I don't know about your speech to text, but mine is a hell of an opportunity for revision. But what I want to know is typing with your thumbs writing.
Lucinda, you had your hand up.
Yes, I have a question about what do we do, how do we help our English learners who are the newcomers? Writing can be a very daunting undertaking even for our experienced writers, but what about our students who are newcomers?
So we've been working with newcomers and with the goal of engaging them in participating in the same work that other students in the classroom are doing. And the way we're doing that is by supporting them in using all the modalities and language resources that they bring to make meaning in as many ways as they can. And for us, that's depending a lot on supporting them to use the language that they do speak. We're providing translations. We're supporting them when they want to Google and get translation. We're supporting them to write in their language that they can express themselves in, and then bringing in resources that can help the teacher understand what it is they're producing. And I think the thing to remember with those newcomers is that they're not going to be newcomers very long. And they are passionate to learn English and be like everybody else in the class. So sometimes I hear teachers worrying that allowing them to use their first language is somehow going to slow down their development of English or demotivate them to learn English in some way. And that's just not the experience that we typically have with newcomers. They're just desperate to learn English. But if in the meantime, they have a way of showing that, yes, they're a 10th grader too, and they know things, and they're bringing things from their background that they can share with the class, even if they're writing it in another language. So that would be my advice. So let them use gestures, let them use the language they bring, and let them talk to others in the classroom who share their language, and make your classroom a context where many languages are heard and it's fine, and you're glad that they're participating.
My question was about feedback, because Steve talked about not giving too much feedback. And I was recounting a paper that a student wrote where they wrote the word "so" 15 times in one page. Yeah. So I focused on just that one piece of writing that I thought needed the feedback. I didn't include all of the other things like run-on sentences. So when giving feedback, would you suggest just to focus on one thing?
Yes and no. So that's really clear. I guess I love threes. So usually if somebody asks me, I usually think about giving feedback on three things that I think are most important. And the so's an easy one. So once you know about the so, there's more likelihood that it won't occur again. But I also want to say we're brain dead when it comes, and brain damaged when it comes to feedback. So I did something with about 500 teachers in Texas 2 years ago, and I had them give feedback, in small groups, what they would normally do, and we talked about it, and it was very interesting, and it was all over the place. but then I purposely gave them another paper a little bit later, after our discussion, written by the same kid a week later. Only 2 out of 500 teachers actually connected the 2 papers. So we have a tendency to treat each paper as a universe of its own, that the 2 aren't connected. And so, when we give feedback, of course, it can have a purpose with that paper, but it can also be used in ways to connect with papers down the line. And in some instances, students need the feedback we give them. We've done some things where we'll have different criteria that students will evaluate places that they think are problematic in their paper. And, when they go to make the changes, we know what their thinking is because they're thinking out loud, they're picking the evaluation criteria. They can't execute the revision. So it's not just a matter of saying, think about this, or a leading question here. Sometimes they need some instruction in between, some teaching. And so that's something I didn't say, but I think is very important. And I'm not saying that it's easy to do, to connect these when you've got 150 students. But in some ways, I think we miss some of the power of feedback.
I'd love for Mary to share her golden rule for giving feedback for people that are not writing project fellows. Start with a glow and then give a grow.
Start with a glow and with a give a
And
grow.
then give a grow.
One other thing that I really want students to see that it's a lifelong, you want feedback your whole life long. My husband and I are both writers. We write all the time. And if either of us has a tricky email message to send, we'll read it to the other one. And it's always better just to get that one better word, a stronger verb. And so somehow getting beyond, get just the teacher, tell me what's wrong with this, but instead that there are very few sentences that can't be improved.
So when I submit an article, I don't want feedback. I just want acceptance.
Okay,
Looks
we have
like
time for
we have time for one last question.
Okay,
right?
great.
Tina from Ohio asks, how do we better connect what is known through research with the practice in the classroom? And this is to all panelists. Do you want me to ask it again?
Yes, please.
Okay. How do we better connect what is known through research with the practice in the classroom?
Well, I'll give a start, and everybody can weigh in, but Project Ready it stands for Reading, Evidence, and Argumentation in Disciplinary Instruction, and it was part of this huge, big Reading for Understanding initiative, and from the beginning required brilliantly that it was multidisciplinary and that practitioners were to be involved from the very beginning of the work. So each project team was tasked with developing and studying an intervention that would address malleable factors in reading comprehension. But the way that we in Project Ready position teachers from the beginning as co-developers of the knowledge has much to recommend it. First of all, we all learned together. We were all walking that road and developing the path as we were trotting. And there are lots of things to recommend that approach. That is, learning from practitioners about what is possible in the realm of, the hoped-for outcomes, what can possibly count and have value in particular grade levels for particular learners, in particular subject areas. Everything got shaped as we worked together through the hands and hearts of the teachers who were involved. So partly, I would say, the answer is in going at this work as a collaborative.
Yeah. I'll just add on one thing to that, and this puts the onus more squarely on the people who do the research and who write about it. And I have 2 things that I don't think I did them very successfully, but I always tried to do 2 things in particular. The first was for every 3 research articles I wrote, I tried to write one for like language arts or the reading teacher or the like, where I went ahead and took the risk of stretching. I tried to stay consistent with the data, but I also tried to interpret what that might mean when this stuff was out in classrooms. And the second was, and I don't think I achieved this at all, and that is to try to write the research studies in a way that was more accessible. The problem is that when we write research studies, we really write them for our colleagues, the peers who are going to review them and, you know, sort of zing us when we haven't stayed within the boundaries of really arcane academic prose. But that doesn't mean you can't, that doesn't mean that you can't have things in your research studies that bring the findings to life. And one of the things that in a couple of studies I was able to do is to not only report the research in terms of significance levels and effect sizes and things like that, but to add a thick description of what this intervention looked like in a classroom, a kind of an ethnographic description. And if you can use multi-methods research where you sort of both give the, dazzle them with data and then tell it with a story, that combination of things is, I think, a way that we researchers can make our research more accessible, because the story would bring the intervention to life in a way that the statistics have difficulty doing.
I would just add, I agree with both those previous comments. We do have a real habit of only speaking to our researcher audiences sometimes, but we do so well when we publish in the practitioner journals and share artifacts from the classroom that really, we can talk about, say, a graphic organizer and all have something in our minds, but when we are looking at the same graphic organizer, then we can be part of the same conversation, I think. So those classroom artifacts are important to share as illustrations. The other piece that I would say, and something that Mary and I have been working on in our work in history education, is to share materials that we develop through research. We've learned so much by working in collaboration with teachers, as Cindy was alluding to, and by working very closely with the students themselves and hearing from them, and that has enabled us to develop curriculum that works and supports students in writing arguments in history, and we're sharing that through our website, and it's free. I started out by sharing through publishing a book, because in my head and my training, that was sort of how I could imagine sharing something. And that has a benefit, and you can sort of be the master of that story, right? And in a website, I guess anybody can come to a book and start wherever they want, but in a website, it's sort of magnified where people come in different ways, but the beauty of it is you can share so much, you can change it constantly, which we're doing you know, as we learn more from teachers and students, we continue to revise the materials. We're now developing professional development materials, so we'll be putting those up there, and I think that's a nice way of communicating and sharing in the work.
All of the intervention work that I've done, where we're trying to change what's happening in the classrooms, I've done in close collaboration with teachers, because I feel that teachers have a body of knowledge that I don't necessarily have, and I have some that they don't necessarily have, and together we're a better team. But as a result of that, and not all my work is intervention work, incidentally, and some research I do on my own, obviously, you know that if you read any of it. But the idea is that when we do this, and very often I have teachers I've been having as colleagues for years and years and years, and now some as long as 30, 35 years, and some newcomers. What's very important is they keep reminding me, without my needing to do it, not overtly, that there's a teacher audience that needs to hear what we're learning. And so it's not only speaking to teacher audiences or to all audiences, but it's writing to everybody, and it's getting the people who are teachers to also be presenting and writing what we're learning about, so that we're a professional community and we're sharing.
And I would just like to acknowledge two of the people in the room that I just wrote a book with, who are teachers, Angie Bayless and Mary Whitman, who I could not have written that book without them. Let's finish with a parting. Steve wanted to say one parting word, and then we need to go to wine and cheese.
So this is a slightly different thing. I agree with everything that was said, but remember I said buyer beware? That cuts every which way. Just because I say it's so doesn't mean it's so for you. And just because somebody's selling snake oil, which I could be selling, doesn't mean it's true for you either. And there's a lot of people who, have their favorite things that they bring out testimonials and all other kinds of things to convince you. And I would say whether you're listening to me, whether you're listening to David or any of us at this table, or whether you're listening to somebody else, be critical. Think about it. Is this going to work for you? Does this make sense with your kids? I think that's, bringing research into the classroom, it's great. But we also want to think critically about everything that we do there. So thank you guys again.